So if it was the Ukrainians, there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable conversations to be had publicly, but all of those conversations have already been had privately, and it didn't change the math of the war. In the aftermath of things like Izium and Bucha, we had a crystallization in Europe. Most European leaders have visited the killing fields of Bucha personally, including the Germans. And so the idea that economics can trump the war at this point, I think we've moved past that. Me personally, I still have no idea. It doesn't make sense for the Russians to have blown up their own pipeline, because that was their single largest energy link and their single largest leverage against the Germans early in the war. And it doesn't make sense for the Americans to have done it. Not that we lack the capability, and the Germans and the Russians had that too, but if you go back to September 1st of last year, that's when the Russians turned Nord Stream off. And they publicly told the Germans that you now have to choose. You can either have the energy from us and still be modern, but the cost of that is you have to stab Ukraine in the back. Or we just leave it off and you deindustrialize, which is something we're seeing right now. And people forget that the Germans chose to side with Ukraine. They chose to risk deindustrialization and the destruction of their social and economic model in order to remain Western. I don't think they get enough credit for that. And so from the American point of view, we were getting ready a really big hammer because we thought the Germans were going to go the other direction. When they didn't, we're like, oh, we'll just put that down. And then 2 weeks later, the pipeline was blown up. So from an American point of view, we got everything that we wanted without having to do anything. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to then blow it up. My personal theory, I think, and it holds up a little bit better, but it's just a theory, is that Russia's Gazprom did it. Now, Gazprom is Russia's natural gas monopoly. The decision to shut off Nord Stream was made by the Kremlin. It was a political decision. And the way the contracts read for supply to the Germans is if the Russians shut off Nord Stream for any appreciable amount of time, they have to supply compensation to the Germans for the natural gas that was not shipped. And they have to do it at spot market prices, which in the aftermath of September 1 shutoff were 7 times what they were before. And so Gazprom was looking down the barrel of a 6-week period that would take every single cent of their profits for an entire year. So my guess is they blew up their own pipeline in order to trigger force majeure, but that's just a theory. Okay, that was all the second part of that. What was the first part? How long can the Russians maintain the financial coherence in the light of all the sanctions? Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Russia celebrates national privation. So this isn't Argentina. This isn't even Turkey. This is a country that prides itself on its ability to suffer. So you have to do a lot of punishment in Russia before you hit a breaking point. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. Also, I was wrong. We haven't seen disruptions out of the pipeline system so far. No one has blown up deliberately the pipelines that cross Ukraine. Oh, by the way, that's one reason why I don't think it was the Ukrainians that did it, because they have access to oil and natural gas pipelines that cross their country that are still operational that they haven't blown up. And we haven't had a problem with insurance yet. There hasn't been a single attack by any sovereign state on any Russian tanker, even though they're flowing by Ukraine and flowing by all the NATO countries on their way to India and China. And Indian and Chinese insurance has stepped into the gap to ensure coverage for the shipments. We haven't had a single incident where any of that has been called into question yet, which honestly is really, really weird, because we normally have several incidents a year across the world where shipping insurance has to pay out. So all these replacement insurance systems haven't had to yet, which is just really strange. So I stand by the forecast that this stuff is still incredibly fragile, but I'm very surprised, and have been wrong, that it hasn't happened yet. But let me layer one more concern into that. Russia is still getting income from its energy exports, but you have to think about where the stuff is. This is a picture of central Siberia. It's permafrost. Now, in the south, I realize that this is a completely alien concept, so just bear with me a little bit. Permafrost is in a territory where it's so cold that the subsoil never thaws at all. So you go down somewhere between 5 and 30 feet and you hit a frozen layer, and ice doesn't drain. So in the summer, when things heat up, the top layer melts and you get these horizon spanning bogs. If you want to produce materials in this environment, What you do is you wait for the land to freeze, and then you bring out a large army of dump trucks filled with gravel, sand, and aggregate, and you build berm roads out to a production site, which are those roads that you see going off to the right. You then build a drill pad and drill in the frozen ground through the permafrost down to whatever the deposit is that you're after. This is the highest production cost and the highest maintenance cost for any energy production in the world. It's higher than it is for most deep water. Here's the problem. Permafrost isn't just difficult to develop and maintain, the landscape also shifts. So if you get a break, a fissure where the land can drain in those summer months, you get a slip like this. Or you can get a situation where it drains down instead of laterally and you get a sinkhole. And I put some people up there at the top so you can see the scale. Or you get a situation where you get a hotter melt one year and some of the permafrost actually does melt, not all the way down, but some of it. And in that scenario, you get trapped, rotted swamp vegetation that is very methane rich, and the methane gets released and you get a bubble that disrupts the landscape. Now, these things happen in Russia all the time, and they disrupt the berm roads and the pipelines. Here's the problem. The Russian educational system collapsed back in 1986. So the youngest suite of people who have the full suite of technical skills to do things like pipeline maintenance, they turned 60 this year. Most of the new oil and natural gas that has come out of Russia in the last 15 to 20 years the work hasn't been done by Russians. It's done by Westerners, and they're not doing it anymore. So even if the Ukrainians don't blow up infrastructure, even if there's no shipping or insurance issue, the maintenance question is going to kill pretty much all Russian permafrost production anyway. That's 2/3 of the total. It's just a question of it happens tomorrow or 10 years from now. And I don't have a prediction for that because that's weather. That's not just geology, that's surface geology. But we know it's going to happen sooner or later, and we know the Russians lack the capacity to maintain this system without extensive outside help. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. Sure. Let's start with the United States because it's the simplest. The shale revolution is very clearly entering its third phase with the super majors working on efficiency. Chevron and Exxon both are attempting to double the recovery rates from their wells over the next 5 years. And even if they only get halfway there, that is another 5 to 6 million barrels a day. So I don't think we're anywhere close to sealing the ceiling on what we are capable of with US shale. The biggest problem we've got in that space is that all shale crude is ultralight and ultra sweet, and most of our refiners prefer to deal with heavier and sour crudes. And so at the moment, we've got this disconnect where we export the light sweet, we import heavy sour in order to refine. Now, those are becoming closer and closer and closer as refineries are admitting in ever larger volume that we're never going back and that they will always have access to light sweet and they won't necessarily have access to heavy sour. But that is a transition issue more than a problem. Canada is probably maxed out. They're probably not going to get another pipeline through the United States within the next decade, which means everything has to be shipped by rail, and the rail export routes are running at capacity. We would have to add significantly more infrastructure to get more from them, something the refineries are really upset about because Canada provides that heavy sour that they like. The Canadians do have a pipeline that's supposed to come online next year called Trans Mountain that is supposed to export via the Pacific coast, but the British Columbia government and a number of NGOs and some First Nations are doing everything they can to make sure that that pipeline never operates. So I have very low confidence that we'll actually get there, which means that Alberta's probably producing about as much as they're ever going to. I think it's stable, but I don't think it's going to rise.